How one ingredient defined a generation of chefs. It was overlooked at first, common, unremarkable, and then suddenly it was everywhere. This story matters now because influence often hides inside the simplest things. We credit movements to visionaries, techniques, or institutions, while ignoring the quiet forces that shape taste from the inside out. To understand how one ingredient came to define an entire generation of chefs, we need to return to a moment when restraint replaced excess. Because today, the same cycles of overuse and rediscovery still govern creativity. For decades, the ingredient existed in the background. It was used sparingly, if at all, too familiar to excite, too humble to headline. Chefs chased novelty elsewhere, leaving this element untouched. Then a shift began. Not announced, not coordinated. A few chefs started returning to it independently. They use it not as garnish, but foundation, not to decorate, but to anchor. The ingredient had a quality others lacked. It amplified without dominating. It carried memory without nostalgia. It adapted easily, absorbing context instead of demanding attention. At first, critics barely noticed. Dishes were praised for balance, depth, clarity. The common thread went unnamed. But cooks recognized it immediately. They spoke about it privately, compared notes, adjusted ratios. Soon, menus across cities echoed the same sensibility. The ingredient appeared again and again in different forms. Fermented, reduced, raw, transformed. Each use felt personal, yet connected. Younger chefs embraced it instinctively. It offered permission to simplify, to strip away excess, to let flavor speak without explanation. It became a quiet rejection of spectacle. Then came saturation. Diners began noticing repetition. Articles named the trend. The ingredient became symbol instead of tool. And when that happens, a question always follows. Is the movement ending? Or is it just beginning to mean something else? As visibility increased, the ingredient carried new weight. What had felt intuitive now felt intentional. Chefs were asked why they used it. Menus highlighted it. The quiet foundation became a statement. That shift made some uncomfortable. The ingredient had never been meant to represent anything. It was chosen because it worked, because it grounded dishes that risked floating away. But trends demand narratives. Writers framed it as rebellion against excess, as return to roots, as minimalist philosophy. Each explanation hardened it further. Inside kitchens, tension emerged. Some chefs leaned into the attention, pushing the ingredient louder, bolder, more frequent. Others pulled back, worried it would lose nuance through repetition. The ingredient itself did not change, but its context did. What once amplified flavor now threatened to overwhelm it. Dishes became predictable. Diners began asking if chefs were relying on it too heavily. The generation that grew up with it felt conflicted. It had shaped their palate, taught them restraint, but now it risked becoming shorthand instead of choice. Some chefs removed it entirely, at least temporarily, not as rejection, but as recalibration. They needed to know whether their voice existed. Without it, others went deeper. They explored its limits, used it in ways that challenged expectation, paired it with unfamiliar textures, treated it as structure, not accent. The ingredient entered its most difficult phase. No longer ignored, no longer invisible, fully seen. And when something becomes visible, it must evolve, because influence that stays static turns into habit, and habit eventually loses meaning. The story now moved toward its defining moment. The defining moment arrived quietly, without consensus. There was no declaration that the ingredient was finished, no backlash strong enough to end it. Instead, chefs began using it less often, but more deliberately. The ingredient stopped appearing everywhere. It appeared where it mattered, when it belonged, when nothing else could replace it. This restraint separated imitation from understanding. Kitchens that leaned on it as signature struggled. Their menus felt hollow once it was removed. Others discovered something surprising. The ingredient had taught them how to taste. It had trained a generation to value balance over impact, to listen to ingredients instead of overpowering them. Even when it disappeared, its influence remained. Younger chefs entering the industry inherited that sensibility without knowing its origin. They cooked differently from the start, Less noise, more clarity. The ingredient no longer needed to appear to shape decisions. Critics began noticing the shift in tone rather than content. Menus felt calmer. Flavors felt intentional again. The conversation moved away from trends and toward values. The ingredient had completed its cycle, from background to foundation, from foundation to symbol, from symbol back to tool. And in doing so, it revealed an uncomfortable truth. Movements are rarely defined by what remains visible. They are defined by what changes how we think, even after they fade. With that understanding, the story approached its final reflection. The reflection arrived not as nostalgia, but as recognition. The ingredient no longer dominated menus, yet its imprint was everywhere. Chefs spoke about restraint with ease. Simplicity felt confident, not apologetic. Balance became default rather than goal. The generation it shaped no longer needed it present to express what they had learned. Looking back, the ingredient had never been the point. It was a teacher. It offered a way to rethink composition, hierarchy, and emphasis. Once that lesson was absorbed, repetition was unnecessary. Today, as new ingredients rise and fall in popularity, this story offers perspective. Trends are not failures when they fade. They succeed when they leave behind understanding. The ingredient did not define a generation by staying. It defined it by teaching when to let go. And in a culture obsessed with permanence, that lesson feels rare. Sometimes, influence is most powerful when it disappears quietly. What the ingredient story also reveals is something about the nature of culinary generations. A culinary generation is not defined by age. It is defined by a shared formative experience, by the specific set of ideas, ingredients, and pressures that shaped the way a group of cooks learned to think about food. The ingredient in this story became part of that shared formative experience, not because every chef of that era used it constantly, but because it embodied a set of values they were all grappling with simultaneously. The value of restraint, of simplicity, of the idea that flavor can be amplified through subtraction as well as addition. That some of the most powerful effects in food come not from introducing something new, but from removing everything that was obscuring something already present. The ingredient was a vehicle for that value, not its source. The value would have found another vehicle eventually, but this particular ingredient arrived at the right moment, in the right kitchens, among the right generation of cooks, to give the value a specific form. And once a value has a specific form, it travels. It can be discussed, debated, questioned, built upon. The ingredient gave a generation of chefs a shared language for something they were all feeling, but had not yet articulated. And shared language is how values become culture, not through manifestos, through the specific practices that embody them, through the dishes that demonstrate them, through the arguments about those dishes that clarify what the value actually means in practice. That process happened, largely without anyone organizing it, across the kitchens of a generation that was ready for it. The ingredient arrived. The generation recognized itself in it, and a shared aesthetic was born. By the time it faded from prominence, the aesthetic had been absorbed so completely that it no longer needed to be signaled by any particular ingredient. It was simply how that generation cooked, how they tasted, how they taught the generation that came after them. That is what it means for an ingredient to define a generation, not to be used constantly by all of them, but to crystallize something they shared and give it a form that could be passed on. The ingredient taught when to let go, and a generation learned, then went on to teach the same lesson in their own kitchens, with their own ingredients, and their own students, who inherited the value without knowing its origin, which is how the most important lessons always travel, quietly, without attribution, through the hands that were shaped by them, and without needing to name them, because the best lessons are the ones you forget learning, the ones that become so fully yours that they no longer feel like lessons, just the way things are, just the way you cook. How